Welcome to the Daily Report. It's Friday, April 8th here in Korea. We're ending the work week with yet another decline in our daily COVID-19 tally, and we have more on this trend and the related tasks ahead later on in the program. Here first to the pandemic updates, I have Kwon-Sua standing by. So just start us off.
Sunny, as we are heading into the weekend, cases have dropped to the low 200,000s this Friday. 205,333 to be exact were tallied as of 12 a.m. And that's including 31 imported cases, with the rest being domestic transmissions. Now, comparing the figure to a day before, it is a decline by around 20,000 infections. And if we compare the figure to exactly a week ago on Friday, it even marks a drop by almost 75,000 infections. And with that, the daily average in cases now stands at below 230,000 in the past 7 days. Going over to our map, we are still seeing 5-digit figures in the metropolitan region, as well as here in Gyeongsangnam-do Province and Gyeongsangbuk-do Province. But as you can see, most places are now reporting 4-digit figures of daily cases. However, Korea's accumulated caseload is now approaching the 15 million mark, and the death toll stands at 18,754. Not a big change in the number of daily fatalities, which are still standing at way above 300. However, the number of patients in serious or critical condition is gradually on the decline, as you can see here now, having dropped to below 1,100. Now let's move over to our vaccination figures. We've got a little under 2,500 people and more than 1,800 people who have received either their first or second dose of COVID-19 vaccine or are considered fully vaccinated. And moving over to our booster shots, a little under 20,000 people have been administered with an extra dose, and that's now equivalent to 64.1% of the nation's population. Now, globally, a little less than 1.2 million new COVID-19 infections in the past 24 hours as of noon Korea time have raised the total to 496.5 million, and 4,015 new deaths were reported in the same span. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for those tallies. Discussions are underway here on the local front about prospects of lowering the national alert level of COVID-19. For more, Shin Yeon is here in the studio. Yeon, welcome back.
Great to be here, Sunny.
Right, so authorities are looking to reclassify COVID-19, which is currently at the highest risk level here in the country, right?
That's right, Sunny. Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum said officials are gathering as much data and analysis as possible to this end. For weeks now, health authorities have been discussing whether it would be appropriate to downgrade COVID-19 in its classification of infectious diseases. Currently, COVID is categorized as a level 1 infectious disease, the highest on the government's 4-tier ladder, and regarded as the most dangerous. A downgrade to level 2 would put COVID-19 in the same group as tuberculosis, chickenpox, and measles. Such a move could be followed up by the lifting of nearly all remaining social distancing rules. In the interim, however, the Prime Minister said partial adjustments to our current measures will be needed. This may include scaling back the number of hospital beds and treatment centers for COVID patients with light symptoms.
I see. Yeah, and in the meantime, I understand the Prime Minister has reiterated calls for the public to remain vigilant, right?
That's right, Sunny. The Prime Minister cautioned that we've been seeing the number of critically ill patients stay above 1,000 for quite some time. That's why he asked everyone to exercise strict precautions.
We can't let our guard down. We need more efforts to achieve our goal of reducing the number of deaths and critically ill patients.
Those efforts also include more vaccinations, which are essential in case of another rebound in cases or a new variant emerging. This is also why they're discussing whether to recommend booster shots for those who have recovered from COVID-19. They're also asking residents at nursing homes and other high-risk facilities to get their 4th doses, which have been available since late February.
Though we're seeing more high-risk people get their 4th shot, the participation rate in some districts only stands at 50%. We ask local governments for more participation so that we can give boosters to as many seniors as possible.
Right, of course. Now, come May, Yeon, the task of managing the pandemic will fall on the incoming Yoon administration, and I understand his transition team is working around the clock to ensure an effective and, of course, continued containment of the situation.
They definitely are. For one, the Presidential Transition Committee is open about learning any new side effects among those who've been vaccinated. Currently, South Korea only compensates people who report side effects that have been officially documented by the WHO, EMA, or FDA, but the new administration is set to recognize more side effects if the evidence supports it and compensate those who experience them. In particular, they're considering financial aid to everyone who visits a hospital for treatment for any vaccine side effect. The government may also provide restitution to families who have lost their loved ones from unknown causes within 30 days of vaccination. Korea is also looking into more alternative treatment options for those unwilling or unable to get vaccinated but who wish to be protected against COVID-19. An Chul-soo, the head of President-elect Yoon's transition team, said the committee would soon unveil a roadmap of the Yoon administration's COVID-19 strategy, which is to kick off within the first 100 days of taking power.
Right, Yoon. Let's now include Soa in our talk. So I understand authorities touched upon the fates of our residential treatment centers that Yoon touched upon earlier.
Right. This is in line what Yoon told us about and what Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum hinted at, scaling back the operation of specific treatment venues. So residential treatment centers, which used to be the main location for patients to recover at, have fallen out of favor ever since home treatment became the standard procedure for mild and asymptomatic patients, which make up the majority of COVID patients due to the nature of the Omicron variant. The government plans a gradual downsizing of treatment centers to better allocate resources and save costs. The operation rate used to be at above 50% at the end of January, but drastically dropped to the mid-10% range in February and currently stands at 18.4%. But officials highlighted it'll be a reduction, not a suspension, as there are still people who have no other choice than to get treated at residential treatment centers.
There are some conditions that need to be met in order to be admitted to a residential treatment center, like people living alone without any caregivers or those who are homeless. We have been assigning the majority of people in these categories to residential treatment facilities.
And the number of hospital beds for patients with relatively moderate illnesses at designated COVID-19 hospitals will also be reduced by some 30%. That will be around 7,000 from some 24,600. Just 35% of those are in operation as of this Friday. To put that into perspective, by the end of February, over 54% were in use.
Right. So what are the prospects, meanwhile, with regard to our social restrictions?
Right, Sunny. The latest social distancing measures are expected to be due until the end on the 17th. So not much time left before a potential scrapping of all the remaining social distancing measures. So let's take a listen to what an official had to say in regards to this at the early briefing.
We had promised before that we take into consideration the current decline in infections and our medical capacity, among other factors, in our sweeping adjustment of social distancing restrictions. We will discuss this issue and announce our final decision on the scale and scope of the eased measures sometime next week, while concurrently reviewing our post-Omicron strategy.
And speaking about a post-Omicron strategy, so I hear there are changes. Well, changes are also expected, that is, within the academic arena.
Right, Sunny, there are expected to be some changes for students from all kinds of grades. With one of those, I can imagine, will be welcomed, especially by the youngest kids, which is fewer self-testing. So the Education Ministry decided to reduce the twice-a-week self-testings with rapid antigen tests for elementary, middle, and high school students before going to school to just once a week for the time being from the earlier twice a week. Now, this recommendation was applied at schools across the nation. However, recently there were assessments that preliminary testings were not as necessary as before, as infected students were exempted from those regular tests within 45 days of contracting the virus, and there were just too many of infections lately. So along with health authorities' discussions on their post-Omicron strategy, the Education Ministry is set to draw up its policies as early as next week to start applying them in May.
Right. So Specifically speaking, so then, what is the trend of COVID-19 infections among students themselves?
Well, at the beginning of March, so when the new school year started until April 6th, there was an infection number of almost 1.75 million among students as well as kindergarten kids. And from 2020, since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in Korea until so far, there were some 2.07 million cases in total. So 35.3% of the nation's students have been now confirmed with COVID-19, and 84% of those have been contracted the virus just in the past month, so after the new school week started. But recently, we are seeing a drop in these infections, as between the 29th of March until the 1st of April, there were some 255,000 infections among students, which is a drop by some 371,000 from the week before. So there is a declining trend among these students with a general decrease in infections here in the country.
Right, that is good to know. Meanwhile, Yeon, also as part of the post-Omicron strategy is the possibility of shorter quarantine for COVID-19 patients.
That's right, but we still don't know the exact number of days authorities have in mind. For the sake of comparison, though, if we compare it to the US and the UK, they have shortened their quarantine period to 5 days. And this is not the first time Korea has considered reducing the self-isolation period for the infected. If you recall, last December, when we first identified the Omicron strain, COVID-19 patients were asked to self-isolate for 14 days. After authorities had more data on Omicron, quarantine was narrowed to 10 days for the unvaccinated and 7 days for the fully vaccinated. From February this year, everyone, regardless of their vaccination status, were asked to quarantine for 7 days only.
Scientific data and real-life cases show that most people infected with COVID-19 don't pass the virus on to other people after a week has passed. So there was no reason to keep longer quarantine periods.
And while there is still debate over the exact transmission period of those who've been infected, the government is still leaning towards shorter quarantine as part of efforts to restore a sense of normality.
Of course. All right, Ian, thank you very much for that report. And Soa, thank you as always.
Thank you, Sunny.
Russia has been stripped of its seat on the UN Human Rights Council in response to rampant reports of its crimes against humanity in Ukraine. The RAM move, in turn, has prompted Russia to declare that it was leaving the council altogether. Our Kim Yo-san reports.
The UN General Assembly on Thursday decided to suspend Russia from the organization's leading human rights body over alleged violations and abuses of human rights in Ukraine. 93 countries voted in favor of the US-led resolution. 24 countries voted against, including North Korea and China, with 58 abstaining. The resolution expresses, quote, grave concern at the ongoing human rights and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Speaking after the vote, Russia's deputy UN ambassador announced that Moscow has decided to quit the council.
The Russian Federation made a decision about ending or suspending its membership in the Human Rights Council before the end of its term on the 7th of April this year. Russia has always considered the Human Rights Council as an important component of the universal system of promoting and protecting human rights. Unfortunately, in today's conditions, the Council is in fact monopolized by one group of states who use it for their short-term aims.
This was echoed by the Kremlin, which expressed its regret about the decision. The EU's ambassador to the UN, however, stressed that the rare decision upholds the integrity of the international body.
Suspension is necessary to uphold the integrity of the Human Rights Council, the authority of the General Assembly, and the credibility of the UN human rights system. The rare decision this Assembly has taken today sends a strong signal of accountability and hopefully will help preventing and discouraging more violations of human rights.
Russia was in the second year of a 3-year term in the 47-member UN Human Rights Council. Suspensions from the council are rare. Libya was suspended in 2011 because of violence against protesters by forces loyal to then-leader Muammar Gaddafi. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Here on the Korean Peninsula, new satellite images show Pyongyang actively involved in preparations to mark the birth of its founding father, which falls on the 15th of this month. Our Song Yoo-jin has more.
North Korea is just a week away from celebrating one of its most important holidays, April 15th, the birthday of the country's founder, Kim Il-sung, known as the Day of the Sun. Apart from previously holding festivals and issuing postage stamps to mark the occasion, the regime has also held military parades in the past. As this year marks the 110th anniversary of Kim's birth, experts forecast that one will take place next week as the regime tends to mark 5th and 10th anniversaries with large-scale events. New satellite images are backing up the prediction. Images from Planet Labs taken on Thursday morning showed tens of thousands of people filling up Kim Il-sung Square located in the capital, Pyongyang. Using placards, people in a section in the west of the square spelled out "United with one heart," while those in the eastern section combined to make an emblem of the ruling Workers' Party. The images also showed what appeared to be either groups of cars or lines of soldiers near what might be a military parade training site. Should a military parade take place, all eyes will be on the type of weapons showcased. The North has previously unveiled major weapons during parades, such as the 북극성-5 submarine-launched ballistic missile last year and the Hwasong-17 intercontinental ballistic missile 2 years ago. Analysts are warning that the North could also stage further military provocations this year. For one, the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Sung Kim, said on Wednesday that there could be another missile launch or even a nuclear test on the Day of the Sun, stressing that Washington and its allies should be prepared. That warning could turn into a reality as the international community has been detecting ongoing developments at the North's Punggye-ri nuclear weapons site. In a new report released through the Open Nuclear Network on Wednesday, satellite images showed clear indications of a newly uncovered entrance to the site's Tunnel 3, evidence of excavation, and continuous signs of traffic near the tunnel. The report added these observations could hint that the North is restoring the tunnel for a future nuclear weapon test. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
Early findings show Korea's current account standing in the black for the 22nd consecutive month, but the surplus itself is smaller year on year. Our Ji-young explains.
South Korea logged a current account surplus for the 22nd straight month in February. Preliminary data released by the Bank of Korea showed on Friday that the balance of trade came to a surplus of $6.42 billion. Outbound shipments of goods in February came to around $54 billion, up 19% compared with the same period last year. They have increased on year for the 16th straight month. Export growth was led by semiconductors with a more than 23% on-year rise, while petroleum products also saw strong outbound shipments increasing by around 66%. However, due to a large rise in imports amid high oil and raw material prices, the surplus was much smaller than a year earlier, down 27%. Imports of goods increased around 26% compared to the same month last year, with raw material imports rising by around 37%. Imports of coal surged by more than 170%, and petroleum and crude oil rose by more than 67% and 63% respectively. The services account posted a surplus of $570 million in February, driven by the transport sector due to the high shipping rates. But with the number of people traveling abroad gradually increasing, the tourism deficit stood at $450 million, up about 30% on year. Ji-young, Arirang News.
41 South Koreans have made it onto Forbes billionaires list this year. Our Kim Hyun-sung has some of their names and more on how much you need to be considered super rich here in Korea.
41 South Koreans were named on the Forbes 2022 billionaire list. Kakao founder Kim Bum-soo and vice chairman of Samsung Electronics Lee Jae-yong ranked the highest among Koreans. Both had a net worth of $9.1 billion, putting them at 223 on the list. 8 business magnates from the gaming industry, including Smilegate founder Kwon Hyuk-bin and Pearl Abyss founder Kim Dae-il, also made it onto the billionaire list. Cho Young-sik, founder of SD Biosensor, which is best known for its COVID-19 test kits, was named a billionaire for the first time. South Korea ranked 15th along with Switzerland for countries with most billionaires in 2022. Also, in South Korea, the wealth needed to be in the top 1% keeps rising. In 2021, to be in the top 1% richest in South Korea, households needed net assets of at least 2.9 billion Korean won, or $2.4 million. That's a rise of almost 12% from the year before. More than 70% of households in the top 1% resided in the capital region, and most of their assets were real estate. On average, the richest made around 20 million won a month and spent a quarter of that on their living expenses like food, education, and housing. Even after spending in taxes, the top 1% had an average of 7.5 million won, or more than $6,000 of monthly income left to spend or save. That's about twice the national average. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
In other news, the ease in regional border controls is boosting prospects of international travel by Koreans to popular tourist sites in Southeast Asia. Arirang reports.
As governments across the world are loosening travel restrictions amid the COVID-19 pandemic, there are hopes that the travel industry could roar back in 2022. Several Southeast Asian countries, which are popular among Korean tourists, have announced that they will make it easier to visit. With South Korea also lifting its quarantine requirement, flight reservations to Southeast Asia increased over 2,600% from March 14th to 28th compared to the previous 2 weeks. That's according to one of South Korea's biggest travel companies, which also says as more flights to the region are planned to be rolled out in May, the number of tourists is expected to increase. Countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines are allowing travelers to enter without quarantine. Thailand requires 2 PCR tests on the first and 5th day of arrival, while Indonesia and the Philippines require visitors from Korea to get a test before traveling, then present the results of the test on arrival. Indonesia only accepts PCR tests, but the Philippines takes both PCR and rapid antigen tests. Those countries are also focusing on making sure travelers are safe. The Philippines, for example, is focusing on vaccination programs, highlighting that 97% of people living in the main tourist spots have been fully vaccinated.
The priority would be health and safety. When people travel now, they want to find out if they will be safe in that destination. So that's what we did as early as 2020. We made sure that all the tourist destinations were ready. They were complying with health and safety protocols. They were fully vaccinated. So that is the priority right now.
The tourism secretary also added that the new travel trend in the post-pandemic era is a focus on health.
And what we notice also is now people are more interested in where their food comes from. So it was a chance for us to really give importance to farm tourism. So people want to pick and harvest for themselves fruits because they want to know where their food comes from. And it highlighted also health and wellness. We are really focusing on health and wellness.
With key tourism countries preparing to greet global travelers again amid the pandemic, not only attractive activities, but a safer environment is becoming more important. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
The shutdown of Shanghai has been extended to include its entire population of over 25 million people as Chinese authorities remain committed to their zero-COVID strategy. For more, I have Fabienne Kretschmer live on the line. Fabienne, it's good to have you on.
Hello.
Right, Fabian, let's start off then with what has been shared about the reason behind the rampant spread of COVID-19 in Shanghai as opposed to perhaps other Chinese cities.
Well, I mean, it might be surprising that even today the numbers keep rising. We have 20,000 cases. Yesterday it was a little less, but almost the same. And yeah, it's the biggest outbreak basically since Wuhan, the biggest numbers. To me, it shows clearly two aspects. And one is that even the very strict measures against the virus, the epidemiological measures in China, seem not to be enough to counter Omicron, which is more infectious. And so it was only a matter of time that this would happen. But yeah, it surprised us all. And I mean, the vaccination rate in Shanghai is very high. So I think it was spreading probably a lot longer and was not detected for a long time.
Right. Now, Fabian, as I mentioned earlier, Shanghai's lockdown, which began about a week ago, has been extended. What have been the implications of this measure on its population of over 25 million people?
Yeah, I can't stress this enough. It's really horrible. I mean, the 25 million people, even the more privileged people there have really essential fear of running out of food. I know I spoke to many residents who told me that basically they haven't been able to order online. I mean, food deliveries, they only relied on what they stockpiled before, and maybe they received one bag of vegetables from the government, but that's basically it. So there's really the fear of having not enough water and not having enough food. Secondly, people are really afraid not only to get infected. That's comparatively a small fear compared to getting dragged to one of the mass isolation centers. I mean, the hygienic conditions there are also relatively horrible, and also many residents are afraid that once they get to the COVID hospitals or to the isolation centers, what will happen with their pets. There have been several videos of dogs getting killed by the health workers because they're afraid that they will spread the virus. And thirdly, the biggest fear is for families, and that's really very severe. They are afraid that if their children get infected, that they will get separated. That has happened before, that children will be carried to COVID hospitals without the parents being able to accompany them.
Right. And speaking about that, Fabian, do walk us through then the protocols that would follow once a person is confirmed to have been infected with COVID-19 there in China.
Yeah, basically it means that your residential compound gets sealed off, gets locked down, basically. And that literally means that you have a steel lock in front of your door or in front of the compound door. You physically cannot go outside. And after this week, if any one of your neighbors still tests positive, then this round of lockdown gets extended. I can, for example, talk about myself. I mean, yesterday I also went out to the supermarket, stockpiled food, I mean, canned vegetables, because I'm also worried it can happen anytime. And usually there's not enough, not a lot of notice beforehand. So people are really afraid that their compound might get locked down just for one positive case.
Right. And Fabian, what has been the public response to this unrelenting containment strategy in the country there?
Well, in Shanghai, you can clearly see that the anger is quite high. I mean, there were, for example, people who were shouting out of their, apartment compound, and they opened the window and then in unisono screamed against the measures. There are also videos of people who are really very desperately shouting around that they don't have food anymore, that they're running out of money because their shop has been closed. So the frustration is really, really very high, but that has not changed the stance of the government. They are more committed than ever to stick to zero COVID.
Right, and staying with that then, Fabian, what would you say are the political implications perhaps of China's zero COVID strategy?
It's a mainly political or dogmatic decision. It comes from Beijing, and the reason why they want to stick to zero COVID, I mean, it is also a concern for public health, but there are many other political aspects to it. For example, in autumn, we will have the 20th Party Congress where state leader Xi Jinping will declare his third term in office, and the leadership doesn't want to have any infection clusters spreading around until then. And also the propaganda here, the state media has been repeated the claim for more than 2 years that the successful zero COVID strategy of China is a proof, it's a demonstration that our system works better than the West and many parts of the rest of the world where the virus is out of control. So now it's really difficult to change their own path.
Fabien, according to US media, some pundits say the shutdown of Shanghai may cost at least $46 billion a month, about 3% of the GDP there. That being said, what indeed are the economic consequences of this containment strategy?
They're huge, and they're also long-term. I mean, this estimation that you quoted was, I think, from last week. So that has not priced in and calculated that the lockdown in Shanghai might get extended. I mean, you have to keep in mind, initially it was only a 4+4 days lockdown, and now it's an indefinite lockdown. And what I hear from companies is that they are really afraid of keeping investing in Shanghai. And as international companies, they cannot find any global talent who want to move to Shanghai anymore. It's really very difficult. So there's a damage for the reputation, but we also know that the manufacturing sector and the service sector, they're both shrinking. So right now, basically, there's an almost as big economic shock to the economy here compared to 2 years ago when there was the lockdown in Wuhan.
Right. Fabien, one final and very quick question. China has been pointing to potential COVID-19 infection arising from overseas mail and parcels. In its latest allegations, authorities there are warning against the purchase of Korean clothing, whose international delivery may reportedly bring in the virus. What do you suppose is the purpose of such remarks?
Yeah, they're using a scapegoat. I mean, scientifically, it is possible that, the surface from some imports could cause infection, but it's highly unlikely. And I think they really try to deflect the blame here. And also German pork knuckles, I mean, I'm from Germany. I know that they were also blamed at one point. That's really dangerous because it can have economic consequences, in this case, possibly for Korea, if people believe in that. And so I think it's really irresponsible.
All right, then, Fabien, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. Omicron infections are on a visible decline here in the country, and authorities have been adjusting their COVID-19 strategy to reflect this promising reality. For more, I have Dr. Kim Seung-taek from Institute Pasteur Korea. Dr. Kim, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
I also have Professor Son Ho-jun from Seoul National University. It's been a while, Professor Son. Welcome back.
Thanks, Sunny. It's nice to be back.
Right. Dr. Kim, we'll start with you. Foreign media claims Korea may be the first country to usher in an endemic phase of this particular pandemic. When do you suppose will this be the reality?
Well, first of all, I have to talk just a little bit about just the word, the endemic. And the endemic actually, according to some epidemiology, actually indicates the status where all the rates are very static. I mean, neither just rising or just falling. But we are still just have to wait where all the stats are very just becoming more just stable. And then sometimes there are some the misunderstanding that whether it's actually just endemic means somehow just now the virus is becoming just more just tamed, just benign viruses. But then this is not the case all the time. But sometimes even the endemic virus, such as the smallpox virus, although the virus is declared as being just eradicated by WHO, but the virus when was actually just the spread on the globe for at least several 100 years, the virus never actually just became the benign or just attenuated. It was still very just pathogenic and very virulent. So the endemic does not necessarily mean any just harmless viruses. But there are some other viruses like some endemic, some coronaviruses, and then some common cold. The viruses themselves there are some tendencies, I mean, some patterns while just replicating and making some mutations. Maybe just the viruses tends to just move for some better replication, which means also some better transmission, while just attenuating is just a virulence. But that's not the case the all time. So based on our experience in the past 2 years, for example, like Alpha variant and then the Delta variant, compared to some original the ancestral SARS-CoV-2, that the virus was more transmissible and more virulent. So then we have to actually just think about those kind of the facts.
Right, I see. And Professor Son, some countries are reporting rebounds in Omicron infections. What perhaps are the risks of a similar scenario here in Korea?
Yeah, so we definitely can learn from countries that have been experiencing this Omicron surge, as well as increasing proportion of BA2 variants and what they call Deltacron, right? So these recombinant variants are surging for sure, and they're taking higher proportion of new infections. Now, what's positive about earlier countries that have experienced this surge, for example, South Africa or United States or UK, generally the trend is that the new infection rates are declining, are smaller peaks compared to the first Omicron peak. Largely, I think it's because the lineage of the new variants are similar to Omicron, so that fast immunity that we've gotten from the natural infections through really rapid surge of new infections probably taken care of some of the immunities and protection of new transmission. But the problem is that we've seen in France and UK that where there's certain lower rates of vaccinations compared to Korea or elsewhere, we are seeing that another peak after that Omicron peak, right? So that we should be still cautious. But another positive outlook is that the death rates, the mortality from the new surge is steadily declining. There's increase, but steadily declining, so that the severity of the disease may be attenuated a little bit. But again, we're still learning through these processes. We've learned a lot, but we also have to know that the new variants are arising every 6 to 8 months, really rapidly. So nothing's over yet, so we need to not let off guard ourselves of the corona pandemic at this time.
Which is why the Prime Minister has also called for more vigilance by members of the public. Right. Dr. Kim, there is talk, as my colleague Ian mentioned earlier, about a possible shortening of the quarantine time for COVID-19 patients from the current 7 to perhaps 5. What are your thoughts?
Well, as was already discussed in this program, that the 5-day actual quarantine period is now already just being applied in the U.S. This is the U.S. CDC guideline. As long as the fever is just goes away, the people can just terminate the isolation after 5 days. So I think that this decision is actually based on the socioeconomic burden, because so many people somehow just infected. So in Korea now, just more than 100, more than just 100, not more than billion people are just isolated. And then if these numbers increase, now just maybe some socially very critical the workforce, maybe very just a limited workforce. So that this actually just considering the some kind of a socioeconomic burden. But in terms of just the virus transmission, there are some well documented just scientific evidence that most of the virus transmission occurs like 1 or 2 days before symptom onset, and also just 2 or 3 days after the symptom. So it's like a period of within the 7 days or 5 days, things like that. So, but then but this is just a kind of the trend. But this is not just 100%. So then the US CDC guideline is that 5 days of just isolation, and plus 5 days of some personal, just a voluntary. Just the quarantine, which means it's just wearing masks, especially with some other people. So depending on some our socioeconomic just burden, our government maybe just think about that. I mean, this is some prior example, especially in just the US. So this is something we can just consider.
Right, and also talking about consideration, Professor Son, relevant officials here are also looking into the possibility of lowering the alert level of COVID-19 from 1 to 2. When should this level be lowered in your view?
Well, I think having a discussion in this direction is right. The timing is a little early because we're still in the big surge of Omicron wave, and we don't know. Each country is a little bit different, right? We can't say we're exactly the same as US or UK or South Africa. Just because the systems are different, people are different, how we respond to all of the social distancing measures are different. So it's a little too early for us to off guard. Like I mentioned earlier again. I think this level of designation in the legality issue also translates a little bit into what Dr. Kim has said about socioeconomic status issues too. that in the first degree would cover a lot of medical expenses. There's a lot of protection and support. Now, when it moves down to the second grade, there's a very explicit language about protecting people, so the coverage of medical insurance and coverage of the services, testing services. We already know that we can't get PCR tests as we used to do, right? When we have symptoms, everyone can get PCR tests. We can't do that anymore. But I think that was the right direction and move because resources were a little bit abused. We need to think really about how best to allocate our limited resources. The decision to move to the next grade is about that, but I think we also have to think about the trade-off of that decision because when we think about socioeconomically more vulnerable people, the history of infectious disease would have said and have shown through tuberculosis or the other infectious disease that most socioeconomically vulnerable populations are the ones that are suffering the most throughout the entire history. So when these services are not covered and they're not working or they're faced with the huge medical bills, right? They're going to be much more vulnerable to the socioeconomic challenges they need to face post-infection, or we still don't know about long COVID, so any other long-term consequences of the infection. So the discussion needs to be made in a very, very categorical and careful way and needs to be very slowly transitioned as we observe the next waves and so on.
Right. So at this particular point in our fight against the pandemic, it's quite premature then?
It's a little mature in my opinion. I wouldn't say really premature, but it's a little early in my opinion.
Right. Meanwhile, on the topic of variants, Dr. Kim, do tell us a bit about what has been disclosed, that is, about the latest XE variant.
Well, the XE variant, according to the report, it seems to be just a recombinant between the Omicron, the early Omicron BA1, and then the stealth Omicron called the BA2. And then this kind of a recombination is not really just an unusual thing. And when the person is infected by the two different, well, in this case, not completely two different viruses, but the kind of the similar, just the coronaviruses. And then when these two viruses replicate in the same cells, there are some chances while they are replicating the genetic material, they can just combine and then just exchange some genetic information. So then this is the very just a natural phenomenon among this virus replication. So then the thing that we are actually concerned about whether this variant is actually increases transmissibility and or severity, and then how it affects our diagnosis and then the vaccines and the drugs efficacy. So in terms of transmissibility, looks like maybe it might be just enhancing some transmission, but we do not know for sure. But I think this is just a matter of just the viral fitness. So if the new variant maybe just outcompetes some other currently just circulating virus, it might just have a chance to just some predominant virus in the future. I don't know how just soon it will be, but it is still just questionable. And in terms of severity, we still need some information about from the people who are infected by the variant, but I think maybe severity. My guess is maybe the severity will be very much like those of just Omicron or just stealth Omicron. And in terms of the vaccines and the drug efficacy, the vaccines, well, my guess is probably the same as the compared to Omicron and the stealth Omicron. And then in terms of drugs, well, this is a combination. I think there's still just small molecule inhibitors, which includes some Paxlovid and the remdesivir and the molnupiravir, would just still just work against the variant, but still just I think just monoclonal antibodies. Still especially for the stealth Omicron, so far only one monoclonal antibody just retains the neutralizing activity, which is the bebtelovimab, which is actually developed by the Eli Lilly. So now just more the variants coming out. Now we are losing a little bit of the weapon, especially the monoclonal antibodies, but other small molecule, just a chemical, just drug, still would still work against the variants as well.
Right, and staying with variants, Professor Sohn, what is your outlook with regard to the potential spread of the XE variant here on the local front?
Well, so with new dominant strains that are arising and have survived the fitness of the viral cycle, we've seen that these new variants are becoming dominant each cycle, right? So we've seen that from alpha to beta to delta to Omicron and to BA1, BA2 becoming more predominant. I think, as Dr. Kim has said, it depends on how this survives within the patients, how the patients, it transmits in our society, and the biological as well as epidemiological characteristics of the virus's transmissibility. And it's a function also of how much population have attained natural immunity, hybrid immunity, and so on, so that the transmission of new variants are disconnected, right? So if that happens, then I think we may see that attenuation of new infections from these new variants. But again, we really don't have any information. We can suspect that this will become a dominant strain if it spreads fast like Omicron. But again, I think we also have to carefully look at how this translates into mortality or number proportion of people experiencing severe COVID.
Indeed, indeed. Dr. Kim, how high are the chances of an Omicron wave rebound in the latter half of this year when we face the colder months?
Well, I think that kind of a statement is actually based on some flu season. But the earlier in the pandemic, people just talked about some twindemic, things like that, and then in fact some co-infection might maybe just exacerbate the patient's symptoms and then prognosis. But then I think this actually just the coronavirus is actually very transmissible, even in some very equatorial region, including very hot, very warm countries. They are still just circulating very rampantly. So we cannot actually exclude. I mean, we cannot actually simply conclude that this virus is very specific only on the some cold season right now. But then I think one of the reason that we are actually talking, maybe this might just re-emerge, maybe we just circulate on the coming fall and winter, is that I think maybe more due to our waning immunity. Several times I talked about some cellular immunity. Cellular immunity will be very long-lasting and then very robust. But our antibody levels will just decline after a natural infection and then the vaccination. And a couple of months later, it will just decline very rapidly. So in this case, without these antibodies, we are again just susceptible to the reinfection. And then so our immune status will actually determine how this virus will just circulate again. But right now in Korea, many people are somehow all of a sudden we got immunity, whether vaccination or some natural infection. So then this immunity, our some population level immunity, will just protect against maybe a large wave of the infection. But in the end, the antibody levels will decline. So then we will be again susceptible to reinfection or reinfection, things like that.
Right, and keeping in mind what Dr. Kim has said, given that then, Professor Son, do you suppose we need to have additional COVID-19 vaccine inoculations?
Yeah, so actually, a New England Journal of Medicine this April 5th, I think, had an article from Israel, reporting data from Israel, about 1 million people who were vaccinated with the 4th dose. They were comparing with those who just had 3 doses. There certainly is an improvement in terms of progression to or people experiencing severe COVID. Severe COVID defined as more of a people hospitalized or ICU admissions or death. It did show that the 4th vaccination did reduce the risk of this by 3.5-fold, right? It's as significant as relative. But when we think about it in terms of absolute risk, this was very, very small. So for healthy populations in general, I think it's at this point, with acquired immunity through natural infection as well as their vaccination, I think so far is okay. For people who are really immune compromised and very vulnerable populations, I think there's a benefit to that. So there needs to be a little more understanding of that, but I don't think there's a need for a widespread fourth shot for the general population at this stage.
Right. And Dr. Kim, authorities here have pledged to reinvestigate reinfection cases, which you mentioned earlier. They're taking into account the reality that reinfection cases here in the country appear to be relatively low compared to the situation in other countries. How do you respond?
Well, the reinfection cases sometimes is kind of just a little bit just challenging to identify because, well, I think as far as I know, the first reinfection case was actually officially reported in Hong Kong almost just 2 years ago. But then the reinfection case was actually observed by the border control, the border control in cases. So then the person was actually infected first, and then like 90 days or later, then in some airport that maybe some quarantine procedure, they actually just picked up by the PCR testing. Without that PCR testing, the person would not be actually identified as the reinfected person because the symptom was almost asymptomatic or very just the symptom was almost just gone because that's due to the some natural immunity by the infection. So then that is why that we actually it is really just challenging to just detect the reinfection cases. And I think estimating just the reinfection in Korea. Well, as of now, our just quarantine procedure and things like that, it does not probably help that much, but I think maybe for some making the future policy or some quarantine guidelines, they might just help as some fact sheet. Yeah.
I see. And now, Professor Sohn, finally, this is probably going to be a yes or no question. Is it true that those who suffer from breakthrough infections are less likely to suffer from a reinfection?
I would generally say yes. The data shows promising that people who've experienced multiple times and of course also vaccinated do have a much lower risk of developing much severe symptoms. And we don't know yet the degree of the symptoms, like let's say a sore throat or how painful it is decreases, but certainly it's becoming a little bit less burdensome to the patients and people.
And largely because of the super immunity that they are believed to have generated.
Yes, I wouldn't call it super immunity, but just that they're more protected through multiple infections. It's like having cold and other.
I see.
Yeah.
All right, Professor Sohn, thank you very much for your insights today. Dr. Kim, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. Right, on that note, we end Friday's edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back on Monday with a slightly adjusted format, so be sure to join us then. Thank you for now.